In Aztec ritual, the cacao bean wasn't just food. It was a stand-in for something else entirely, the human heart, cut from a sacrifice victim and offered to the gods. The Aztecs believed both held the same kind of precious liquid inside, blood and chocolate. So before a person was sacrificed, they were given a cup of chocolate to drink, dyed red to make the connection unmistakable. That's not where chocolate started, and it's nowhere close to where it ended up. But it tells you something true about this substance that's been hiding in plain sight for 5,000 years. Chocolate has never just been food. It's been currency, medicine, a battlefield ration, a religious sacrament, a status symbol worth more than gold, and underneath almost all of it, a system that ran on someone else's forced labor. This is the real history of chocolate, and the ending is closer to the beginning than you'd think. We have to go back further than the Aztecs, further than the Maya, all the way to the Amazon rainforest, where the cacao tree actually originates. By around 3300 BC, a culture in what's now southeastern Ecuador had already domesticated it. We know this not from written records, but from residue scraped out of ancient ceramics, starch grains unique to the cacao tree, traces of a compound called theobromine. Fragments of DNA that could only have come from this one plant. From there, cacao traveled north into Mesoamerica, where it took on a life nobody in the Amazon could have predicted. The earliest solid evidence of people drinking something cacao-based dates back to roughly 1900 BC, on the Pacific coast of what's now southern Mexico. And it wasn't chocolate as you'd recognize it, it was bitter, frothy, and watery. And there's even evidence that some of the earliest cacao drinks weren't chocolate at all, in the way we define it, but a fermented, mildly alcoholic beverage made from the sweet pulp surrounding the beans, not the beans themselves. The line between the first chocolate and the first cacao drink is genuinely blurry. Because for over 1,000 years, people were experimenting with this plant in ways that had nothing to do with what we'd recognize as dessert. By the time the Maya were drinking it regularly, around 600 BC, it had become something close to ceremonial. It showed up at weddings, festivals, official rituals, and funerals, placed in tombs as an offering for the dead. Both the beans themselves and the elaborate vessels used to prepare and serve them were given as gifts and tribute. According to some historical accounts, only adult men were considered fit to drink it. The stimulating effect was thought to be unsuitable for women and children. And it functioned as money. Among the Maya, cacao beans were valuable enough to operate as actual currency, a practice that lasted for centuries. Spanish observers after the conquest recorded the exchange rate directly: 30 beans for a small rabbit, 1 bean for a large tomato, 100 beans for a turkey hen. People counterfeited it. They'd mix in dough made from ground amaranth seed or wax or broken avocado pits, shaped to pass as the real thing in a transaction. When something gets faked that consistently, that's usually a sign of exactly how valuable it had become. Nobody bothers forging currency nobody wants. The actual process of making it was laborious in a way that's almost unrecognizable today. Beans were fermented, dried, and roasted. Then the husks were removed and the nibs ground by hand against a heated stone slab called a metate, turning them into a thick paste. That paste would be hardened into blocks, broken apart later, and mixed with water and other ingredients. When heated, the fat cocoa butter would rise to the surface and get skimmed away. This basic method, hand grinding on a heated stone, stayed essentially unchanged for over 2,000 years, all the way into the 1800s. The drink itself was finished with a flourish that mattered enormously to the people drinking it. It was poured from a height back and forth between vessels, specifically to whip up a thick brown foam on top. The quality of that foam, its darkness, the color of the bubbles, even the smell, was how you judged whether the chocolate in front of you was good or cheap. By the time the Aztecs inherited chocolate culture from the Maya, it had become something close to sacred and something tightly restricted. Common people largely didn't drink it the way nobility did, though it wasn't entirely locked away either. It was used widely in healing rituals, marriage ceremonies, and travel blessings across the broader population by the time the Spanish arrived. But the refined, elite version, pure, carefully prepared, served at banquets as the final course that belonged to the royal house, the lords, and a class of long-distance traders called the Pachteca. There was one notable exception to that exclusivity: soldiers. Chocolate was considered a stimulant, and it was issued as battle rations, eaten as hardened pellets or wafers rather than drunk, because a soldier in the field didn't have time for ceremony. The Aztecs believed cacao was a gift from the god Quetzalcoatl, and the connection to the divine was inseparable from a much darker symbolic thread. The bean became associated with the human heart. Both were considered vessels for precious liquid, blood and chocolate treated as near equivalents. That symbolism wasn't subtle. The drink was often colored red with a natural dye called annatto, specifically to reinforce the connection. And it shows up at its most explicit in the run-up to human sacrifice, where the condemned were given chocolate to drink before their execution. Cacao trees couldn't even grow near the Aztec capital. The climate was wrong, so the empire solved that problem the way empires usually do. They conquered a region called Soconusco specifically for its cacao, and demanded the conquered population pay tribute in beans. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Aztecs were tending roughly 1.5 million cacao trees in that region alone. Traders carried it across the empire on their backs, in loads of up to 24,000 beans, weighing 50 to 60 pounds per trader. This was a civilization that had built currency, military logistics, religious symbolism, and conquest itself around a bitter, foamy drink most modern people wouldn't recognize as chocolate at all. And then in 1519, the people who'd built all of that met the people who would take it apart. Spanish conquistadors encountered cacao when Hernán Cortés observed it in Moctezuma's court. At first, they hated it. Spanish accounts from the era describe the drink as bitter and strange, and the foam on top, the part Mesoamerican cultures prized most, was to Spanish taste actively repulsive. Here's where the story takes its first quiet turn. The Spanish population in the Americas was overwhelmingly male. And the people who knew how to actually make chocolate, who'd held that knowledge for generations, were women. Aztec women, married into Spanish households or working as domestic servants, were the ones who taught an occupying population how to drink the thing they'd just conquered. To make it bearable to Spanish taste, they changed it, sweetened it, served it warm instead of cold. Added cinnamon, a spice that didn't even exist in Mesoamerica before the Spanish brought it, which means the traditional Aztec hot chocolate, sold today, never actually existed in Aztec hands at all. By the mid-1500s, chocolate had crossed the Atlantic. And it crossed as medicine, not as a treat. Spanish physicians wrote home describing a long list of ailments they believed it could cure, and several Spanish writers, including the royal physician to King Philip II, claimed it was an aphrodisiac. That reputation followed chocolate across Europe for the next 2 centuries, gaining it equal parts fascination and suspicion. Here's the part that should sound almost absurd to a modern ear. As chocolate spread through Catholic Europe in the late 1500s and 1600s, it triggered a genuine, sustained religious controversy. Was chocolate food or was it drink? The distinction mattered enormously because church law required fasting, abstaining from food, not drink during certain religious periods. If chocolate counted as food, drinking it during a fast was a sin. The debate ran for over a century, dragged in multiple popes for formal rulings, and was still being argued by theologians well into the 1700s. Eventually, it was settled in chocolate's favor. But for 100 years, an entire continent's elite class was anxiously asking whether their afternoon drink might be putting their soul at risk. There's a French noblewoman's letter from 1671 that captures just how seriously people took the supposed dangers of chocolate. She wrote about a marquise, who she claimed drank so much chocolate during her pregnancy that the child was born with darkened skin and died shortly after, offered as a real cautionary tale about the substance's power. It wasn't true, but people believed it, and that tells you something about how potent and slightly dangerous chocolate felt to the people encountering it for the first time. By the 1600s, chocolate had reached England, arriving at almost the same time as tea and coffee, and Spain had stockpiled hundreds of thousands of pounds of cacao in Madrid alone. It had become a fixture of European aristocracy, served by specially formed guilds of professional chocolate grinders. Prepared in elaborate silver pots designed specifically for stirring and frothing it. By the late 1600s, it was so embedded in English institutional life that it became compulsory in British Navy rations. Here's the part that should sound familiar if you've heard how sugar's story went. As demand exploded across Europe through the 1600s and 1700s, Spain ramped up cacao production using the encomienda system, forced labor extracted from indigenous populations. And when disease and brutal conditions caused those populations to collapse during the 16th century, the supply chain didn't stop. It relocated, production shifted to places like Venezuela and the Guayaquil coast of Ecuador, using enslaved labor brought from Africa. The pattern is almost mechanical in its consistency. A commodity becomes desirable in Europe, the labor required to produce it becomes unbearable. And someone decides that labor should be coerced rather than paid. It happened with sugar, it happened with cacao. The two were, more often than not, produced on the very same plantations, by the very same enslaved workforce, shipped on the very same boats, because for most of this history, sugar and chocolate weren't separate industries at all. They were the same colonial economy, wearing two different names. For nearly 300 years, chocolate stayed essentially what the Maya had invented, a drink, made by grinding roasted beans by hand on a heated stone. Then, in the 19th century, everything about it changed in the space of about 50 years. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten patented a process that could press the fat, cocoa butter, out of ground cacao, leaving behind a powder that could be mass-produced cheaply. This single invention is the hinge point of the entire modern chocolate industry. It's the difference between chocolate as a rare aristocratic beverage and chocolate as something a factory worker could afford. There was an unexpected wrinkle, though. At the time, nobody had figured out what to actually do with all that leftover cocoa butter being pressed out. It took until the 1860s for anyone to find a real commercial use for it. In Britain, it was Quaker families, the Frys, the Cadburys, the Rowntrees, who built the first major chocolate companies. They were teetotalers who saw chocolate as a moral alternative to alcohol, and they built their factories around that conviction, even constructing entire model villages for their workers, meant to promote what they considered a healthier, more sober way of life. In 1847, Frys combined cocoa butter, cocoa powder, and sugar into something genuinely new. A chocolate bar you could actually hold and eat, rather than drink. For a while, because cocoa butter itself was still expensive, eating chocolate like this became, ironically, a luxury item all over again. Chocolate had been reinvented, and reinvented itself right back into something only the wealthy could easily afford. Within decades, Swiss innovation pushed it further. In 1819, the first chocolate factory in Switzerland opened, producing something notably more bitter than what we'd recognize as chocolate today. Daniel Peter figured out how to combine newly invented powdered milk with chocolate in 1875, creating milk chocolate as we know it. Milk had been tried in chocolate before that, but it spoiled too fast to work commercially until powdered milk solved the problem. A few years later, in 1879, Rodolphe Lindt invented a process called conching, agitating liquid chocolate continuously, sometimes for days on end, that turned chocolate from something coarse and gritty into something smooth enough to melt on your tongue. Before Lindt, all chocolate had a certain grit to it that nobody questioned, simply because nobody knew anything different was possible. He kept the technique a closely guarded trade secret for 20 years, because he understood exactly what he'd built. Between 1880 and 1914, chocolate consumption in the United States grew by over 400%. In England, over a similar window, it roughly quadrupled. It had gone, in less than a century, from a locked-away luxury to a mass-market product sitting in every corner shop, and for the first time in chocolate's 5,000-year history. Eating it overtook drinking it as the dominant way people consumed it at all. But scaling something up that fast means scaling up the demand for cacao beans. And that demand had to be met somewhere in the early 1800s. Portugal began commercial cacao cultivation on the African islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, and brought the slave plantation system with it directly from Brazil. When Portugal formally abolished slavery in 1869, under serious international pressure, the plantations didn't actually stop using forced labor. They used what's been described plainly by historians as legal trickery, workforces that were technically not enslaved, but were captive in every practical sense. By 1905, São Tomé and Príncipe had become the largest cacao producer in the world. And here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. The company that eventually exposed this wasn't a government or a human rights organization. It was Cadbury, the chocolate company itself. In 1908, a Cadbury investigator filed a report describing the labor system on these plantations in the plainest possible language: de facto slavery. The following year, Cadbury Frys, and Rewrote jointly boycotted the Portuguese plantations and shifted their sourcing to British-controlled Ghana, which would go on to become the world's largest cacao producer for most of the 20th century. A company built by anti-slavery Quakers ended up entangled in a slave labor supply chain anyway, and only confronted it once it became too visible to ignore. This is where the story should end if history worked the way we want it to. It doesn't. The forced and child labor crisis in cacao didn't end in 1909. It moved the way it always moves, into West Africa, into Ghana and the Ivory Coast, which together now supply over half of the entire world's cocoa. In 2000, a documentary called Slavery, a global investigation brought renewed public attention to the issue, and in 2005, members of the U.S. Congress backed a voluntary industry agreement, the Archangel Protocol, meant to address child and forced labor in cacao farming. It was voluntary, and by 2018, researchers studying its impact found, in their own words, little evidence that it had actually worked. Today, just 5 companies, Mars, Mondelez, Ferrero, Nestlé, and Hershey, control nearly 2/3 of the entire global chocolate market, a market worth over $100 billion a year. And underneath that scale sits an uncomfortable, persistent truth. The same fundamental shape that existed in the 1500s, wealthy markets demanding more cacao than the world can ethically supply. And someone somewhere paying the difference in their own labor never fully disappeared. It just changed addresses. There's a strange counter-movement happening at the same time, though. Starting in the 1980s, a small number of producers began doing something the industrial chocolate world had completely abandoned, making chocolate from a single named origin, a single plantation. Sometimes a single harvest year, treating cacao the way wine producers treat grapes. It's called bean-to-bar, and it's grown from a single producer in the late 1990s to dozens of independent makers within about 15 years. Most of them, notably, don't source their beans from West Africa at all. Despite West Africa supplying the overwhelming majority of the world's cocoa, a quiet signal about where in the supply chain people feel comfortable putting their name. And the entire industry, mass market and craft alike, is now facing a threat that has nothing to do with labor or economics at all. Cacao trees are extraordinarily vulnerable to disease, and by some estimates, as much as 38% of all cacao harvested in a given year is lost to disease before it ever reaches a factory. Combine that with deforestation, soil exhaustion, and a changing climate, and the entire 5,000-year-old crop sits on shakier ground today than at almost any point in its history, which means the story of chocolate, the one running from sacred ritual to forced labor to your local grocery store shelf, still doesn't have an ending. It's still being written, one bad harvest and one industry pledge at a time. So go back to where this started. A drink, dyed red, handed to someone about to be sacrificed, because the people who made it believed chocolate and human blood were made of the same precious substance. It's tempting to treat that as a strange, distant ritual from a vanished civilization. But strip away 500 years of empire, conquest, industrialization, and global trade, and the uncomfortable thread running through all of it is still there. Chocolate has always cost more than its price tag says. Someone has always paid the difference. Next time you unwrap a chocolate bar, that's what you're actually holding, not just cacao and sugar and milk, a 5,000-year-old debt that's never quite been settled.